I want to go over something that a guy I know named Aaron Losey has been pushing on the drift car side for a while now, and that is building seat time cars that are inexpensive to operate and basically get you out there to develop your skill as a driver rather than relying on the build to get you where you're trying to go. His position is you can spend a ton of money building like a super fancy car that has all these really cool parts that maybe to the outsider looks awesome, but ultimately is going to end up being less reliable and doesn't help you as a driver develop your skills. So I want to take what he's putting out there and basically apply that to the off-road world because I see the same thing happening. Specifically since, I don't know, the last like 8 years or so, basically since like the JK came along. I remember whenever I got into wheeling back in like the early 2000s, a 35-inch tire was a big tire. If you had lockers, like you had a very capable Jeep, everybody was out having a good time. There were like the Toyota guys that, were still doing doublers and stuff back then. And then there were like the Jeep guys that had 4 liters in power. And like if you were super special, you had like a 5.0 and a YJ. Since then, the buggy craze has really caught on. Rock bouncers have come about. People are seeking more and more power due to like racing. King of the Hammers has really driven the aftermarket to new heights. There's incredible parts out there that are indestructible, that are allowing people to build heavier rigs, more powerful rigs, bigger tires. Stickies have come along. They have way more traction than we could have ever dreamed of. And as things have progressed, people have kind of developed this sense that they have to have the latest, greatest, biggest, baddest thing to go have fun. And I have personally seen it with a lot of my friends who have dropped off the scene where it's just gotten too expensive. It's become too time consuming. They have a vehicle that they have a ton of equity in that they end up needing to use that equity somewhere else in their life. And so they end up selling it, and then it's an unobtainable object from that point forward, and they just basically drop out of the sport. And there's a lot of new people that have come in to replace them buying those rigs. So they maybe didn't start out with lockers, or they did start out with lockers. They didn't start out open diff. They didn't develop like the base skills to wheel, and they're stepping into a hardcore rig right off the bat. Or maybe they have a JK and they already started out with a Rubicon and they didn't develop the necessary skills to really become a competent driver by being on 31s and open diffs and stock gears and breaking parts, that are weak from the factory, and understanding what the limits of the vehicle are mechanically, and also learning the skills to finesse rather than, I heard somebody, or I read somebody earlier describe their wheeling style as like going by Braille or wheeling like Helen Keller and feeling their way through the trail. And you shouldn't have to do that. Like you should be able to read a trail and pick a line and really use the rig to its fullest ability rather than having a rig that has way more ability than you do as a driver and you're just point and shoot at that point. So one of the things that I think I'm going to actually do is I'm going to start going around and talking to some guys as I go wheeling and talk about their specific setup, what it costs them to realistically operate it. Like what does a weekend cost? How much do they spend a year in maintenance? How many times do they get to go out and wheel? How much has it cost them to build that rig over the years? What would they have done differently? And ultimately, are they happier now that they're on 1 tons and 42-inch red labels and have 35 grand in their rig versus like 15 years ago whenever they were wheeling that stock YJ? Maybe it had like a set of waggy axles in it and like some 33s. Like, are they actually having more fun today? Is it necessary to run the trails that they're on? I recently put together, well, I say recently, I actually put it together about 5 years ago, but I finally kind of dug it back out. But I have a pretty weird little XJ thing that's like super light, and I've kind of solidified my assumption that weight is a major factor in building a rig, specifically in the cost of running it. Um, you can get away with less expensive parts that are cheaper to replace if they break. There's less wear and tear on the rig. The maintenance costs long term are lower. I've gone down the 1 ton route. I've had V8 rigs, I've had buggies, I've had a lot of 1 ton rigs, and they fail. I don't care if you have axles that are indestructible, there are other components that are related to that build that will wear out due to just the unsprung weight or the overall weight of the vehicle. Joints wear out, shocks. It can just be like electrical issues, even just because you have like a hodgepodge V8 swap. There's all sorts of peripheral systems outside of just those axles that can cause a lot of problems on the trail that people don't really talk about. It's really common for me to go out and see even just like ARB failures. It's like, all right, so you have this badass rig, but you didn't route the lines properly, and now you don't even have a locker. What there are all sorts of issues that plague rigs outside of just shaft failures, gear failures, drive shaft or drive line failures. I've actually had it happen to me. Transfer case bolts back off, and you basically just spit the transfer case out the back. I dealt with a buggy the other day that came down on the skid plate, and the skid plate was too close to the oil pan and broke the aluminum oil pan. I can't tell you how many power steering failures I've seen due to people running, small pulleys trying to get more pressure to turn bigger tires. Like, there are other systems other than just drivetrain that end up plaguing a rig. And what I've determined from my experience is the lighter the rig, the less stress those components are on, the smaller the components can be, and ultimately the more value you get. I don't I don't feel like I need to harp on this, but like, the economy isn't getting better. Money's not becoming more valuable; it's becoming less valuable. And I think going forward, it's going to be tougher and tougher for people to continue to maintain the lifestyle that they have. And if we can start to kind of think forward as a community and start to put out there this idea that you don't have to spend a whole lot of money and have like super bling parts to have a competent rig. I think we're going to end up with a better community in the long run, with more people that have rigs that are fun to be with. Because there's nothing worse than being on the trail with some rig that has $80,000 dumped into it and a jackass behind the wheel that can't pilot it. Like, we've all been behind the trail plug that has a rig that's way overbuilt for the guy. He has no business being on the trail, and he's making a clusterfuck out of it for everybody else. And like, nobody wants to be that guy, because that's got to be the most frustrating feeling in the world. So I don't know. There's a lot of egos involved in this sport, and I understand the push to want something that's like super cool, and like I suffer from that too. Like, I'm a pretty big ego guy, and I just think that like, ultimately, for the sport to continue to progress healthy, drivers that are enjoying themselves out there, we kind of have to reevaluate what we have going on. And ultimately, like, $150,000 red dot buggies aren't up everybody's sleeve. And at the same time, junkyard axles really don't need to be used anymore. Like, it's not 2007 anymore. We don't have to run stock junkyard axles with factory gears and factory shafts and all that stuff. Like, there are better solutions. These JK axles that are out there, man, I don't really know what to tell you guys about this, but they're light and they're strong, and they have totally different components in the same name as some axles that have a bad reputation, but they're not the same thing. And they're underneath rigs that are 6,500 pounds with 37s, and they're surviving. That's the weight of a 1 ton truck. Like, my F250, actually, it's a 6.0 crew cab short bed. I think it weighs 6,200 pounds, and it's no big deal for a JK with armor to weigh 6,200 pounds and be out there on some 37s and some chromos and hold together with a set of Rubicon axles. So you take that, you put it into a super lightweight rig that has a reasonable power level, that is nimble, and doesn't have a 130-inch wheelbase, and all of a sudden you have something that's actually pretty capable and will hold together and isn't that expensive. You can pick up a set of built JK axles for 5 grand, and I kind of I push anybody to build a set of 1 tons for 5 grand, that can go underneath something and hold together as well. You know, there's all sorts of other systems that are applied to that. Um, just like the steering, like my rig without any hydro assist with a 37-inch sticky is perfectly capable of turning that tire, but it's because the sprung weight is very low, the unsprung weight is very low, and the scrub radius is very low. All of those things come together to basically create something that's super reliable, easy on the components. There's not a lot of stress, no failures, and if you applied that across the board to other builds, like I understand Cherokees are kind of their own little weird thing, but you know, the Toyota guys figured this out, I think, about 15 years ago, and somehow that's been lost in the ethos. But um, I don't know. Just I really like what Aaron Losey's doing. You may check out his channel. He does Lone Star Drift. He puts on the drift events for Texas and stuff like that, and he's into rock crawling. He has a couple of rock crawlers and Jeeps. He's friends with Kevin Williams, or anyway, he's kind of around in the rock crawling scene too, and I think what he's talking about and what he's putting out there can be directly applied to our sport, and I think it would really help breed a little bit of a new culture, that would ultimately be better for the long run, and we'd see a lot of our friends stick around in this instead of jumping over to razors or whatever. I think that the SRRS guys actually have also kind of solidified this point that I'm making, where like if you look at what they're doing with the Razor buggies, where they're like taking the Razor 1000s and putting them into tube chassis, and they're running like, I don't know, 33 or 35-inch tires or whatever those guys are doing, they're running the same trails as all the 43-inch buggies, and you know, you have to kind of commend them for that. They're really proven that the weight is a huge factor, and ultimately they're able to run a lot smaller parts, and it all holds together a lot better. And I think that they're having more fun doing it. You know, once again, I don't know what it costs those guys to run, but I know that the big boys are spending thousands of dollars every week that they run those cars. So, you know, we can take away a little bit from that too. So that's what my rant is today. And hopefully I can find some other guys to talk to about this, and maybe we can start a conversation about rethinking what we were all doing back in 2007 with V8 1 tons.